Here's a story you've probably heard. A small country wants to build a port. It doesn't have the money. So a richer, more powerful nation steps in and offers to lend it billions. The port gets built, but the ships never come. The loans come due, and when the small country can't pay, the lender takes the one thing that matters, the port itself. A foothold on the Indian Ocean for 99 years. This is Hambantota in Sri Lanka. And for years it was Exhibit A for one of the scariest ideas in modern geopolitics, that China had learned to conquer countries without firing a shot, by trapping them in debt. It even has a name, debt trap diplomacy. There's just one problem. When researchers actually pulled the loan documents on the most famous debt trap in the world, almost none of the story held up. So today, two questions. What really happened at Hambantota? And why did a story this wrong end up in the mouths of presidents, vice presidents, and on the front pages of newspapers on every continent? Before we get to Sri Lanka, you need to understand the real mechanics, because the trap is real. It just doesn't work the way the headlines say. Every developing country faces the same fundamental problem. Economic growth requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires money, and money is always in short supply. A modern port can cost $1 billion. A dam can cost several billion. A national power grid can cost even more. Governments rarely have that cash on hand, so they borrow. And borrowing isn't inherently bad. Some of history's greatest growth stories ran on debt. The United States borrowed to build railroads. Post-war Europe borrowed to rebuild. South Korea borrowed aggressively in the 1970s and turned it into a miracle. The question is whether the investment generates enough economic activity to pay it back. When it does, everyone wins. When it doesn't, this is what happens. As debt levels rise, so do the annual interest payments. Those payments start crowding out everything else: healthcare, education, the maintenance of the very infrastructure the loans built. The government faces a choice: cut services, raise taxes, or borrow more to service the existing debt. Most choose to borrow more, and each new loan makes the hole deeper. Under severe pressure, currencies can collapse. A falling currency makes every import more expensive, pushes inflation higher, and makes it harder to service any debt denominated in foreign currencies, which most of it is, because nobody will lend to a distressed country in its own money. That's the trap in its pure form. Not a conspiracy, not a predator, just the compounding math of debt that outgrows the economy it was supposed to build. When a country reaches the edge, it usually turns to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Relief comes, but with conditions: austerity, spending cuts, privatizations, economic reforms that favor creditors over citizens. The country gets breathing room and loses a degree of sovereignty over its own economic decisions. That's the machinery. Now here's where it gets interesting, because there's a version of this story the world spent the last decade believing that got almost every detail wrong. The phrase debt trap diplomacy was coined in 2017 by an Indian strategist named Brahma Chelani. It spread immediately. Within a year, the Vice President of the United States was warning the world about it from a podium. Think tanks built careers on it. It went into textbooks, and the logic was elegant. China had launched the largest infrastructure lending program in human history, the Belt and Road Initiative. Trillions of dollars in loans for ports, railways, and power plants across the developing world. The trap, critics argued, worked like this: lend a country more than it can ever repay. Wait for the default. Then convert the debt into ownership, a port here, a mine there, a chain of strategic outposts quietly encircling rivals. They even had a name for it on the map: the String of Pearls. And Hambantota was the smoking gun. China lent the money. The port flopped. Sri Lanka fell behind. In 2017, Colombo handed the port to a Chinese company on a 99-year lease. Loan, default, seizure. A perfect, terrifying little machine. There was just one thing wrong with it. It didn't happen that way. Start with the most basic question. Whose idea was the port? Not China's. Hambantota was the personal project of Sri Lanka's president at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa. It was his home district. He'd been chasing a port there for years. And before he went to Beijing, he took the project to Washington and to New Delhi. Both passed. It was a weak commercial bet, and they knew it. China said yes. That isn't a predator setting a trap. That's a lender of last resort taking a deal nobody else wanted. Now the number that breaks the whole story. By 2016, how much of Sri Lanka's government debt was owed to China? About 9%. The Hambantota loan specifically came to roughly $1.3 billion, under 5% of total external debt, at interest rates averaging around 2.5% over 15 to 20 years. In the world of sovereign lending, that's not predatory, that's cheap. So what actually wrecked Sri Lanka? High-interest short-term bonds sold on Western capital markets. By 2019, servicing those bonds consumed more than 40% of the government's annual debt payments. Add reckless tax cuts, chronic trade deficits, and a pandemic that erased the tourism industry, and you get the real catastrophe. The 2022 collapse, the default, the government driven from power by protesters storming the presidential palace. One analysis put it plainly: Sri Lanka's debt crisis was made on Wall Street, not in Beijing. And the seizure? It wasn't one. China didn't take the port to cancel an unpaid loan. The 2017 deal was a separate transaction. A Chinese company paid Sri Lanka around $1.1 billion in cash for a long-term lease. Sri Lanka took that cash and used it to pay down its Western bonds. The Chinese port loans? Colombo kept paying those separately. Strip it to the studs. No default on Chinese loans, no debt for equity swap, no Chinese naval base. The machine was a story, which leaves the better question. If the evidence was this thin, why did the whole world believe it? 3 reasons. First, fear. China's rise made people anxious, and anxious people reach for simple, sinister explanations. A story about a patient predator is more compelling than a story about a poorly run bond market and a president who wanted a monument in his home district. Second, it was useful. The debt trap story wasn't spread by neutral observers. It was amplified hardest by the governments most threatened by Chinese influence, the United States and India chief among them. When a narrative helps you against a rival, you don't fact-check it. You give it a microphone. And third, nobody reads the footnotes. A strategist asserts it. A politician repeats it. A newspaper quotes the politician. A textbook cites the newspaper. By the time it reaches you, it isn't a claim, it's common knowledge. And common knowledge is almost impossible to kill, even after the evidence beneath it is gone. That's the real hidden system in this story. There was never a Chinese debt trap. There was a narrative trap, and almost everyone walks straight into it. But here's where the story flips a second time. Busting the myth doesn't turn China into a charity. The original instinct, that debt creates leverage, is correct. It just works differently than the cartoon. China rarely seizes anything. What it does instead is lend with opacity, terms kept confidential, collateral clauses buried, other creditors kept in the dark. And when a borrower struggles, Beijing typically renegotiates rather than forecloses. It extends the loan, quietly forgives a piece, offers a rescue. Every rescue deepens the relationship, and relationships have weight. Not a trap that snaps shut, a dependence you can't afford to walk away from. And Beijing is far from alone. Consider Argentina. In the late 1990s, the country borrowed heavily on international markets to cover persistent deficits, pegging its peso to the dollar to maintain investor confidence. When the economy contracted and the peg became unsustainable, the spiral accelerated. The government borrowed more to defend a currency it couldn't defend. By 2001, it defaulted on nearly $100 billion in debt. The peso collapsed. Savings were frozen overnight. Unemployment hit 20%. Ordinary Argentinians watched their purchasing power evaporate in weeks. No Chinese loans, no Belt and Road, just the same compounding math we described at the start, and a government that ran out of road. And Greece. When its debt crisis broke open in 2010, the EU and IMF provided a bailout. The conditions were severe. Years of austerity, public sector cuts, pension reductions. The economy contracted sharply. Unemployment exceeded 25% at its peak. Critics argued the medicine was designed more to protect European banks holding Greek debt than to help Greek citizens. The country gained financial survival and lost significant control over its own economic policy. That's the deepest point, the one that China panic conveniently obscures. This lever was never uniquely Chinese. The IMF has been reshaping economies through loan conditions for 70 years. Western bondholders did it to Sri Lanka. They did it to Argentina and to Greece. Whoever holds the paper holds a piece of the borrower's future, whether the lender flies a red flag or a blue one. So come back to that quiet port on the Indian Ocean. We were told it proved how China conquers with money. What it actually proves is something quieter and far more useful. The most powerful force in this story isn't an army, and it isn't even alone. It's a story simple enough to repeat, and frightening enough that no one stops to check it. Debt really can become leverage, over any country, from any lender. But the next time someone hands you a clean tale of villains and victims, ask the one question that cracks open almost every myth. Who benefits from you believing the simple version? Tell me in the comments.